just Advaita anti-emergentism. Uh, Emergentism as a metaphysics of mind is fairly well known, and I think as an intuitive understanding. Uh, just a minute. There's an intuitive understanding of what emergentism is, which is to say, matter in itself is not conscious, but in certain arrangements of matter, mind, consciousness, subjectivity, subjective experiences, whatever you want to call, emerges from it, right? And that's a fairly popular view in contemporary analytic philosophy of mind. Uh, some, including Nobel Prize winning scientists, have endorsed it, so I don't think that matters too much. Though it's a fairly popular view, though there have been very serious objections to it as well. Now, but if you were to consider seriously the question of can consciousness emerge from matter, my impression is most people here would say no, right? I mean, given a certain inclination towards Indian philosophical views, but historically, within Indian philosophical views, there has been at least one school which seemed to posit something like emergentism, which is the Charvakas or the Lokayatas. And various schools have argued against the Charvaka view. And at least when in contemporary interpretations of the Charvaka view, it's typically the objections posed by the Jaina philosophers Haribhadra or the Sarvadarshana Sangraha by Advaita and Madhva, or by some Buddhists through which the Charvaka view itself is reconstructed. And amidst this, what seemed to also get missed is that the Vishishta Advaita Vedantins, not Ramanuja, but Yamunacharya and Desika or Venkatanatha, both specifically offer arguments against the Charvaka materialism, which we can today understand as a rejection of certain kind of emergentism, which is what I want to talk about in my talk today. So a brief background about Vishishta Dvaita itself is sometimes, I mean, who say no to the question of whether consciousness can emerge from matter. They are a Vedantic school. Often Vishishta Dvaita itself is explicated as qualified non-dualism. They are realists, as in they are realists about uh, the perceptible world, the individual cells, and matter, and so on. And the whole sort of metaphysical challenge for them is to say how the universe of Chit and Achit, of sentient and non-sentient entities, are both distinct, yet ultimately, in some sense, identical to Brahman. Uh, right? And their whole view is that the universe of sentient and insentient entities are inseparable, yet distinct in terms when considered as ontological categories from the only one real individual or ultimate substance that there is, which is Brahman. And they are also a theistic school. Brahman is ultimately identified with Ishvara, who is the union of Vishnu, Narayana, and his consort Lakshmi or Sri. And historically, the Sri Vaishnava religion that derives from Vishishta Dvaita is seen as an amalgam of the theistic Vaishnava theism of the Alvars, the 12 Alvars, the Tamil saints, the Pancharatra Agmas, and the Vishishta Dvaita philosophy. And of importance to us is their view on causation, which I'll delve into in my talk itself, called Satkaryavada, which ultimately I mean, borrows from a certain Sankhya view of causation, and that they reject the view called Dehatmavada, or the body is the self view, which really, I mean, the only people I think they're arguing against are the Charvakas. So my aim in this talk is to construct a Vishishta Dvaita anti-materialist emergentist argument taking into account the other metaphysical commitments, specifically the metaphysics of causation, and show how really are they responding to Charvaka emergentism, specifically a very contemporary or how might they respond to a very contemporary interpretation of Charvaka emergentism that Ganeri has offered in 2011. So the protagonists whose work I shall be largely referring to are those of Yamunacharya, who is one of the pre-Ramanujite. He was in fact Ramanuja's guru as well, and Ramanuja himself, and the greatest systematizer within the school, Venkatanatha, also more popularly known as Vedanta Desika. So a quick outline, this will be the outline of the talk itself. I shall briefly gloss over what the Charvaka view is, and then what are the specific anti-emergentist arguments that Yamunacharya and Venkatanatha offer, and then really delve into the account of causation and taking that into account, sort of offer a slightly different yet a reconstruct or a more contemporary interpretation of the Vishishta anti-emergentist argument, which I think is sort of a kind of argument that any emergentist, maybe a contemporary Lokayatan or anyone else, I think has to really argue against. So, okay, Charvaka school or often the sort of picture presented of the Charvaka view is something like this, that they accept only perception or pratyaksha as a pramana, they are thoroughbred materialists, and they deny anything which is trans-empirical, which informs their very this-worldly ethics, and their denial of anything such as liberation or God or karma or even dharma in some sense. But I think scholars such as Pradeep Gokhale have shown how this is not exactly true. I mean, they are not very strict empiricists. They accept and often allure to certain kinds of inferences which are laukika, which I mean inferences which sort of draw upon empirical observations and do not go against their other commitments such as materialism. And that really informs their emergentist metaphysics as well. So a slightly more nuanced view of the Charvaka school would be at least what is common to all their views is that they never accept verbal testimony as a pramana, which sets them apart from those of the Vedantic Nyaya Sankhya schools as well as the Buddhists. And they deny the existence of God, karma, and other worldly realities, including liberation and dharma. But most importantly, they do not strictly deny inference. Uh, right? So on this basis, I mean, this is the background against which we need to understand their emergentism itself. And the sort of the roots of their emergentism lie at Brahaspati, whose dates I don't think are ascertained very accurately. So he compares the emergence of the Atman, the self and its consciousness and Chaitanya, uh, from the body as analogous to the emergence of, say, the power of intoxication from herbs and molasses, which in themselves do not have, or at least they are in a state initially where they do not have the power of intoxication, but when they undergo certain processes, they do uh, obtain the power of intoxication, right? Or another common example is how betel nut leaves and areca nuts themselves are not red in color, but when you put them in your mouth and process them by chewing and mixing them with your saliva, there is a redness that emerges out of it. So this is the analogy that Brahaspati himself draws, right? And this straightforwardly seems to be a case of emergentism of something, a property, a novel property that emerges from the emergent base across time. So typically this is interpreted as a form of diachronic emergence and emergence across time. 2011, Janardhan Ganeri offered a very contemporary interpretation of the Charvaka view in terms of supervenience and transformation. Supervenience really is the metaphysical relation wherein if the base and the emergent or the phenomena are such that any change in the emergent phenomena correlates with a corresponding change in the base and vice versa. If there is any change in the base, there ought to be a corresponding change in the emergent phenomena as well. So in this case, if the mind were to be supervenient on the body or bodily processes, this would mean that any change in the body, while there is supervenience, would be accompanied by a corresponding change in the conscious mental state. or any change in the conscious mental state would have to be accompanied by a change in the body itself, right? And sort of supervenience was posited as a relation to save materialism, more specifically to address certain concerns about the causal role of the mind itself, which we will get into. And Ganeri sort of interprets the Charvaka emergentist view as a certain kind of supervenience. So to read it out, it will be true to say that mental properties are reducible to the properties of the transformed physical base, but equally true that they are irreducible to the properties of the untransformed base. So he says, body as such is not the supervenience base of uh, consciousness, but body or the body parts undergo certain transformation, similar to how, say, the betel nut leaves and areca nuts undergo certain transformation. And in the transformed state, they serve as the supervenience base for the emergent properties, right? As so expressed, the idea seems to be that the elements themselves acquire new causal powers when they are in a certain state, namely the state of jointly composing the body, powers that they did not have beforehand when they were in other combinations with other elements. This is different from the view that the body as a whole has powers which none of its parts have individually. It is instead the view that the parts themselves have new powers conditionally upon their membership of the whole, right? In the transformed phase of the body, by virtue of being part of the whole, the transformed whole, it has new properties, which is the properties of conscious mental states, which are supervenient on the transformed emergent base. That's sort of Ganeri's interpretation of the Charvaka view. And his sort of motivation for here, his sort of motivation for interpreting Charvakas and offering this interpretation itself is to claim that the Charvaka emergentism can address a certain challenge that supervenience face, which was most famously put forward by J. Guan Kim, which is really this. Say, imagine if E1, which is the experiential state, is emergent from body B1 at time T1, and then at time T2, the bodily state 2 is caused by the bodily state 1, and E2, the mental state or the emergent mental state at time 2 were supervenient on body state 2. It seems that we don't, I mean, on such an account, there is no causal role for the emergent state 1 even to play, because even is surely not causing E2 on this account, because B2 is sufficient for E2 as the supervenience base, and B1 is causally sufficient for B2. So then what there is the causal role for E1 at all was the question. So either you seem to have to say that experiential properties have no causal role, are epiphenomenal, or deny that the physicalist base as such is causally closed. Neither of it seem to be attractive. So what Ganeri does is he interprets at least the Charvaka view of a later Charvaka Lokayatin called Bhatta Udbhatta, who is referred to in certain Buddhist texts by Kamalashila, as positing something like this, which I'll take you through. He says at time 0, the body is not the supervenience base, but it undergoes certain transformation, and then the transformed base at time T1 is the base, the supervenience base of the emergent property E1, right? And then the transform base 1 also causes transform base 2, which is the emergence base of the mental property at time E2. But he also alludes to this concept of an assistive cause, or sahakarika, which I think he says the emergent phenomena at time T1, along with the transform base at time T1, are in some sense required for the transform base at time T2. And it's not just a straightforward, causal relation between E1 and TB2. Rather, he says it is only by virtue of E1 that TB2 is individuated as the specific supervenience base of E2. That is, without alluding to the prior mental state, we cannot identify what the emergence base of the future mental state is going to be. So that, he says, is the sort of assistive causal role that he attributes for mental sort of properties, which are the emergent properties itself, in that they play a sort of a causal role in accounting for or individuating the emergent space as the emergent space in the future, uh, in the forthcoming sort of supervenience relation itself. All right, and after this account, he says, then the real question for the emergentist account is not one of causally accommodating, but saying what is it that causes the initial transformation? Because once you have the initial transformation, he thinks this formal model sort of accounts for any objections that an emergentist account might face, which according to really is the question that Jack poses. So I want to show that that really is not the question, and he and Jake Kim are actually missing a point, and what the point they are missing is what I want to bring out. Right? So I want to now take you through the sort of classical arguments that both Yamunacharya and borrowed from Yamunacharya Vedanta Desika also posit. Yamunacharya offers in Atmasiddhi six different arguments against Dehatmavada, the body is the self view. Of this, I want to really highlight two. The first argument is what I call the argument from the subject object divide. He says the body is known as the object of knowledge and perception, whereas the self is never known as the object of knowledge and perception. So he ostents to what we might today call an epistemic gap, and but for him, really, he thinks of it as immediately pointing to a metaphysical gap. He really doesn't explicitly draw the distinction between an epistemic gap and a metaphysical gap, as we might understand it today. The second argument is the argument from anti-emergence. So I think this is worth sort of reading out. He says, in opposition to the analogy given by the Charvaka, the emergence of the self and its consciousness from the body is not tenable for the following reason. The redness caused by betel nut, etc., is likewise produced by causes which possess the red color generated by mixing of different substances after their parts have lost their cohesion in the act of chewing. Hence, the red color perceived in each of their parts too. Consciousness is not found in the parts of the body individually, nor have they been said to possess it. If that were admitted, as it would follow that in one and the same body there must be many thinking beings, it is impossible to say which is primary and which is secondary. Besides, all references to recognition would be impossible. So this I found quite interesting in the sense that this seems to predate very typical anti-emergentist arguments, which is to say that if the self and consciousness were to, in some sense, be present in the body or emerge from the body, it would then have to be that every body part in itself, which constitute the body as a whole, would have a self of its own. And for various reasons, he thinks that is not tenable. We'll get into why as well for that, because Venkatananda really expands on this. So Venkatananda takes this up in various of his works. I mean, mainly in Nyaya Siddhanjana and Tattva Kalapa. In Nyaya Siddhanjana, he again sort of expands on Yamunacharya's argument and says if Dehatmavada were to be true, that is, if the body is the self view of the Charvaka is to be true, it could be true in one of three ways. That the self and consciousness is present in every part of the body, or the collection or the aggregate of the body parts together have the self or consciousness as its guna. Or the third is the composite body is in itself a substrate, a dravya, which is distinct from the individual parts, and that has consciousness. Right? So he sort of delineates these three ways in which it could be true, and then goes on to reject each of these for the following reasons. Right? The first one is he thinks if there are multiple cells in every part of the body, that would lead to the fallacy of Abhipraya Veda, which for really is to say that it would be tantamount to the body being a village, and nobody in a village can sort of agree with each other. Everybody is going to have differences of opinion and views and intent. So then it would be the case that the body as a whole would never act towards an intent, which is clearly not the case. We are all able to act in some sense, a unitary way in the world. So it is for them, this seems to prove that every part of the body, which you sort of take further extent, which would be every fundamental material entity, if you want to call it an atom, would have to be a self of its own, would not be tenable for this opposition of Abhipraya Veda. And he also thinks there is Vyatireka Jnana, or similar to what Yamanacharya said, we cognize the difference between the body and the self by virtue of the fact that we observe bodies. Bodies are presented to us as objects of perception, whereas the self is not. The self is rather the thing to which perception is presented. Right? So he thinks Vyatireka Jnana sort of refutes each of these, but in addition to this, he offers for the view that there are multiple cells in the body because of Abhipraya Veda. Then the second view, which is the self is identical in some sense or emerges from the aggregate of the body parts for the following reason. He says it's given to us as a structured collection, which is really only the collection is only a guna and it's not a substrate, whereas the self can never be a guna. It will have to be a substrate. And further, he said, if consciousness itself cannot be, if you think of conscious content as a guna, it cannot be the guna of another guna. It has to be a guna of a substrate, whereas the collection as such is only a guna and not a dravya. So this he calls the Sangha Tattva Hetu. And the third possibility is that the self as a whole, the composite whole, is in some sense a separate kind of substrate, which he outright denies. He says, in some sense, I think Katanada would be today called a Mariological nihilist, or at least some adherent of the composition as identity view. He doesn't think the whole is anything over and above the parts. He denies it. However, even if one were to accept that it's a separate substrate, the whole is a separate substrate from the parts, he thinks the view is untenable because the whole cannot have attributes which the parts do not, which might seem quite so, but that's really what I want to expand on. And to do that, we really need to understand what the theory of causation is, right? So he does not literally mean that the wholes cannot have the attributes of the sort that the parts cannot, but the whole cannot have certain kinds of attributes when the parts do not have them. And what is that? That to do that, we really need to get into the metaphysics of causation, right? So the sort of question which I want to investigate further is this. I mean, there seems to be an ontological divide that Venkatanatha and before him Yamunacharya are ostending to, which comes really from two things. One is that in perception, I mean, objects are given in perception, whereas subjects and the self are known to us as subjects of the experience of the objects, which is really the Vyatireka Jnana, and the Sangha Tattva Hetu, that is that cells cannot be attributes, what really is the whole and what kind of attributes that can it have, right? So why does Venkatanatha and the Vishishadvaitas think that this cannot be bridged? Why can't the whole have attributes that the parts do not? But clearly there are some attributes that the whole seems to have that the part does not, if such a whole were to exist. But what are those kinds of attributes that he is alluding to here? So to understand this, we need to get into their metaphysics of causation and a brief background on the discourse on causation itself. Typically, in most Indian schools, admit of two kinds of process, which is the upadana karana or the material cause. For example, the material cause of a clay pot is the clay, and nimitta karana or the instrumental approximate cause, which is in the instance of the clay pot, the agent who brings about the change, the potter, right? And some accounts also allow for a third kind of cause called the sahakari karana, which is in this case.
Just for a second, because the speaker is being funny, and it's we don't hear you very well. Just for a second. Can you use the other mic? Yeah. Can you try this mic?
It's not working. I'll try something else. No. Okay, turn it on.
Oh, yes. Hello. Hello.
Sound.
Sound.
Try and get on. No, the one on the seat over there behind.
Another one. Hello. Yeah, seems to be. So in the case of the clay potter making the clay pot, the material cost is the clay itself. The potter is the Nimitta Karana, and the instruments he uses, like the potter's wheel or all the Sahakari Karana. And within these, broadly, there are two kinds of views, Satkaryavada and Asatkaryavada, where Satkaryavadins hold that the effect is wholly present in the cause in some way, and then they'll have to account for what is this that we see as change, whereas the Asatkaryavadas, like the Nayayikas, would hold that the effect is not present in the cause. Effect is something new that comes in the out of the cause in some sense, right? So the Vedantins are all Satkaryavadins, but of a very different kinds of Satkaryavada account. For example, the Advaitins typically posit a kind of Vivartavada where they say the effect is ultimately illusory, so there is no change that they need to account for. Whereas other Vedantas offer various versions of Parinamavada, where they say it's a transformation of what was already existent. And Vishishta Advaitins also can be understood as positing a certain kind of Parinamavada, which I shall really get into now. And the origins of the Satkarya Vyada view for them historically lies in uh, uh, Chandogya Upanishad, in the dialogue between Udalaka and Shvetaketu, where they say there is one distinct knowing which everything else you can know, right? To say that ultimately there is one thing only which if you know all its effects as well. So ultimately the effects are present in its cause. I mean, I'm drawing a slightly broad picture here, right? And Ramanuja in his Vibhashya accounts for Satkaryavada, his version of Satkaryavada as follows, right? He says the essence of the substance remains the same. For example, and the paradigm case of causation, and they're really discussing causation in the context of how Brahman causes the universe of sentient and non-sentient entities, right? He says the substance in the cause, the material cause, remains the same, whereas it is the attributes which I understand as, in some sense, arrangements of the stuff that is the substance undergoes change, right? So think of the clay as such. The clay, in some sense, is rearranged. It's the same stuff, but it's rearranged to form the pot, right? So the potness is just, as Ramanuja would understand it, a difference in the attributes of the same stuff, right? So similarly for Ramanuja, it's Brahman, which is the same stuff, consciousness stuff. Again, this is my interpretation, and I'm not sure how accurate an interpretation of Ramanuja could be. It is the same consciousness stuff that gets, in some sense, rearranged in the ways that consciousness could be rearranged, and out of which the world arises, the world of sentient and insentient jiva and prakriti. Right? And then he alludes to okay, I mean, when he says this, he's immediately faced with a question, or at least one of the Purva Paksha view that he wants to address is the view from the perspective of the Sankhya, who say, okay, if this is the case, how can Achit Prakriti emerge from Brahman, the essence of which is Chaitanya or Chit or consciousness, right? Because, at least as the Sankhya's view it, Prakriti and Purusha are different kinds of stuff, different kinds of substances. And to this, Ramanuja alludes to the Antarayami Brahmana and says that ultimately it is the same Brahman, the nature of which is consciousness, is the Antarayami, typically translated as inner controller of the Achit Prakriti as well. And this somehow for him seems to indicate that Achit can come out of Chit as well, right? Whereas Vasishtha Advaitins want to deny the opposite. They want to deny that Chit can emerge from Achit, which is sort of the view that they want to refute, the Charvaka view, right? So then the real question is, how is this at all possible, right? For them, how can Brahman, which is of the nature of consciousness, be the inner controller of the non-sentient universe and be the inner self of the Antaratma of everything, including Prakriti, which presumably is Achit, right? And it seems to me that to understand this, we need to acknowledge that Ramanuja and the Vasishtha Advaitins seem to be talking of inner and outer, not just in terms of control, but in terms of an inner and outer sphere, right? So when Brahman, the nature of which is consciousness, is the Antaratma and the Antarayaman of Prakriti, which means Brahman considered as consciousness is the inner nature the inner sphere of what appears to us as Achit Prakriti as well. Again, this seems, when I was reading Ramanuja, this seemed to be the way I ought to understand it, but it seems to me that's perhaps not the only way that Ramanuja has been interpreted, but I am happy to say that this is probably me and not Ramanuja. Right? And that's how he accounts for sameness and change. The sameness derives from the sameness of stuff, whereas change happens only in the arrangements of stuff, or which are differences in attributes. Right? So given this is how I sort of understand Vasishtha Advaita account of changes in the material cause itself. And taking the example of Brahman and the universe, Brahman, which is pure consciousness, is the only stuff that there is. The stuff can be arranged or structured in various ways, just like how clay can be arranged in various ways. The consciousness stuff can also be arranged in certain ways, which appears to other consciousness stuff. There is jiva as non-sentient material stuff, rocks, buildings, water, so on. Their arrangement is such that you may not be able to attribute cognitive capacities to them, like you can to certain other arrangements, such as bodies of humans, animals, and so on. Nevertheless, the stuff they are constituted of is conscious, the stuff which is the ultimate nature of Brahman, and Brahman is their inner controller. The non-conscious materiality or physicalness of matter as we understand them are only in relation to us and our cognition of them. In themselves, in their inner nature, a non-sentient universe is conscious too. And Venkatanatha also sort of adds to this response to the Sankhya possible objection that the cause and effect are continuous. I mean, this is my paraphrasing, for it is the same substance that exists both in the cause and effects. Rather, the effect, on the other hand, is new only in the state assumed by the cause, what he calls the avasthanarapatti. When considered only in terms of the state, right, which for him is an attribute, the effect state does not exist in the cause. These new states are produced only under certain conditions at certain times. Nevertheless, it is the same substance, the same stuff that is in the new state, right? And for him, hence the universe of sentient and non-sentient are just new states of uh, the Brahman, right? But the new states were also present in a subtle state or a shukshma, which then become the sthula universe, the gross universe, or so on, right? And this change for him, he characterizes it as utpatti rather than manifestation of abhivyakti. Maybe I'll get into it in questions if people are interested, right? So if this is the case, I think we can sort of reconstruct the anti-emergentist argument inspired by the Vishishtadvaitins as follows. If the Atmavada is true, the self and consciousness should be either present in all parts of the body or in the collection of the parts. I am denying, along with Venkatanatha, that there is a whole which is a substance. If the self is present in every part of the body, then we will be led to a conflict between the various cells and various parts. We do not see such a conflict, therefore, each part cannot have a self. And then you adopt Vasishtha version of Satkaryavada, and also adopt the ontological divide that they seemingly allude to, which is the Pratireka Jnana. And if you accept both Satkaryavada and the ontological divide, and that cells are not present in every part of the body, you are led to the conclusion that self cannot emerge from the body and is hence distinct from it, which is really sort of a slight modification of the argument that the Vasishtha Advaitins pose against the Charvaka themselves. However, how do we respond to it? I mean, okay, before that, if you consider this argument, the real question facing emergentists is not one of causation or what the initial spark that led to transformation is, but it's a question of stuff, right? It's only the same kind of stuff that can emerge from the emergent base. There are two options. One, you can accept the distinctness and dualism, or accept that physicalness in the inner stuff are ultimately the same as consciousness, which in a way, Vishishtha Advaitins do, but they don't think there are multiple physical stuff. There's only one stuff, Brahman, right? So, so why do we? Okay, maybe I'll leave it for the questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much.